Obviously, I had no choice but to discuss the ongoing invasion of Ukraine by the world's favorite Russian autocrat, Vladimir Putin. Which works out perfectly because I've been following it every step of the way. This event has kick-started the first major conflict in Europe since World War II, which is, if you didn't already know, kind of a big deal. This is of course a rapidly changing situation, so who knows what will have happened by the time this video makes its way to your screen. Seeing as just about everyone else on the internet is already discussing events on the ground in Ukraine, I'd like to shake things up a smidge and talk about the history leading up to the conflict, then speculate on the future of Putin's regime and of Russia as a whole. Because as much as this war has major implications for the people of Ukraine, the backlash has been much more severe than what Putin was probably expecting. Now, full disclosure here, I'm just a weenie on the internet who is certainly no expert on Russian foreign policy, but I'm doing my best. So let's get into it. First things first, a bit of incredibly simplified context. Ukraine used to be a part of the Soviet Union, which collapsed in the late 80s and early 90s, resulting in the many countries that were a part of it to be separated and become their own sovereign nations. Following the collapse, Russia was strongly urged by the US to start moving towards a capitalist economic structure, which saw the economy open up to international markets, deregulated prices of many goods, and mass privatization of formerly state-owned industries. Now, if you've watched any of my previous videos about what happens when a country starts implementing these sorts of economic policies, you'll know that this usually results in the rich becoming richer and the poor becoming poorer, which is exactly what happened to Russia. A handful of Russian billionaires came to control a massive portion of the country's wealth and industries, who were allowed to do anything and everything they wanted thanks to the extremely corrupt government run by Boris Yeltsin and his inner circle. The Russian people unsurprisingly became angry and started protesting in force against Yeltsin's regime. And rather than being thrown from the window of the Kremlin by an angry mob, Yeltsin instead resigned and handed his position over to our boy Putin on December 31st, 1999. Putin was a KGB spy during the time of the Soviet Union, but moved towards a political career shortly after the collapse, becoming a close ally to Yeltsin in the years he was in government. Putin inherited an incredibly weak and unstable country, but managed to nonetheless implement policies which brought the economy back to life, which has resulted in the living standards of many average Russian people steadily rising over the years since Putin's leadership, though not nearly as much as the living standards that both Putin and his billionaire buddies have enjoyed. Now, something that has plagued Putin every day since he rode his horse shirtless into the Kremlin is the expansion of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. NATO is a defensive alliance formed by Western countries following World War II with the signing of the Washington Treaty, and was purportedly created to act as a facilitator of diplomacy between Russian and American interests. In reality, it was created to stop the Soviets from further expanding territory and increasing their global influence by ensuring Russia that if it attacks one of them, it's attacking all of them. Any European country can apply to become a member, though there are some requirements listed on NATO's website, including new members must uphold democracy, including tolerating diversity, new members must be making progress towards a market economy, their military forces must be under firm civilian control, they must be good neighbors and respect sovereignty outside their borders, and they must be working towards compatibility with NATO forces. It began with 12 countries, slowly adding more over the decades, with a total of 30 member countries today. Exploring the entire 70-plus year history of NATO will be impossible in a 10-minute video, so let's specifically look at NATO as it applies to Putin and his rule over Russia. As the Union collapsed in 1991, it is said that Russia's then president Mikhail Gorbachev was promised by the US that NATO would not expand its membership any further than its present state. Now, this was an informal promise that wasn't put into writing, and the Russians insist that they were promised there would be no NATO expansion, but the Americans insist this never happened. So I, a humble Google historian, have no idea what the truth here actually is. I don't trust the Russians, and I don't trust the Americans. But in my opinion, it doesn't really matter what the truth is here, because countries willingly apply to join NATO anyway, and NATO is a defensive alliance. Surely enough, in the years since, NATO membership was granted to a further 10 countries, a few of which were formerly part of the USSR. Putin was not a fan of this development, and in 2008, the Russian military invaded Georgia. Not that Georgia. That Georgia. When its leader hinted that Georgia had ambitions to become a NATO member. The war ended after only 12 days of fighting, resulting in a ceasefire agreement after a few hundred deaths of soldiers on both sides and several hundred deaths of civilians. Georgia is still not a NATO member. Fast forward to Ukraine in 2014. As a former Soviet bloc, Ukraine has had a tumultuous history since the Union's fall. Leading up to February 2014, Ukrainian leadership had seen months of civil unrest, with people protesting the government's refusal to cooperate with the EU, instead favoring a stronger alliance with Russia. In the later half of that month, the protests turned deadly, resulting in many deaths of both protesters and police. Despite this, the protesters managed to take over the government and install new leadership. This greatly disappointed Putin, who soon after sent in a military force to the largely Russian-sympathetic Crimean Peninsula, taking it over and absorbing it into Russia's territory. This move was condemned by some, but since Crimea was generally approving of Russian leadership, and Russia managed to pull it off quickly and quietly, the event didn't draw too much attention. Aside from the Crimean annexation, Ukraine has since mostly been allowed to do its own thing, slowly becoming more democratic and strengthening its economy. However, starting in 2017, the Ukrainian parliament began making steps towards obtaining a NATO membership. And since the election of Ukraine's current president, Volodymyr Zelensky, in 2019, Ukraine has pursued an even more urgent strategy to become a part of NATO, which, as we know, Putin isn't too cool with. Tensions have been rising ever since, with Ukraine blocking many important Russian trade routes, and with Russia constantly performing military exercises near their border. So that's more or less the string of events which led to the invasion we've all been watching unfold in real time. Now, to better understand Putin's motivation to invade Ukraine, we need to look at the current state of Russia as a whole. Though the Russian economy has steadily improved since the 90s, with huge increases to their exports of crops and minerals, it is highly dependent on the revenue generated by the export of oil and gas. Russia also, believe it or not, puts an enormous amount of resources into its military, which has been steadily growing into the behemoth that it is today. With roughly 900,000 to 1 million active soldiers, it makes for a massive force. But many of these soldiers are conscripted, so it's tough to say exactly how passionate many of these men are to die for Putin. The Russian industries are controlled by a small number of impossibly wealthy billionaires who exert an ungodly amount of power within their spheres of influence. Billionaires who all have close ties to Putin and his administration, which are all well known to be highly corrupt. The Russian media is nothing more than a propaganda machine designed to pump out a Putin-approved narrative, resulting in a general public who have little idea as to what is true. But for those who begin to question the narrative, Russia's police have never been shy when beating, imprisoning, and murdering people who speak out against the government. For example, Russian lawyer and outspoken critic of Putin, Alexei Navalny, led a number of demonstrations protesting the corruption of Putin's regime. Instead of self-reflecting and maybe changing the way that he leads his people, Putin tried and failed to have him assassinated in 2019 as he was on a flight to Germany, which Putin denies. But Putin also denies being 5'7". In a shockingly macho move, Navalny returned to Russia to continue his stand against Putin, promptly being arrested as he stepped off the plane and thrown into a cozy Russian prison, where he remains today. This is modern Russia. An unequal, repressive, and terrifying place for the vast majority of people, led by a small group of power-hungry maniacs who control all of the wealth. With all of that context out of the way, let's look at the ongoing invasion of Ukraine and the consequences Putin's regime and the Russian people are facing due to this act of aggression. As most of us already know, Russia's military invaded Ukraine about a week ago, beginning on the 24th of February, sending in large numbers of planes, tanks, choppers, and confused teenagers to take over the country. Putin stated that his motive for starting this war was to denazify Ukraine, claiming that there were just too many Nazis in Ukraine and they needed a principled liberator like him to come in and save everyone. While far-right-leaning people do exist in Ukraine, they have very little political power and are hardly a serious enough problem to justify an invasion. And their president is Jewish. Since Russia rolled in, they've been met with fierce resistance from the Ukrainian people, including President Zelensky himself, a man whose balls will undoubtedly one day make for a prized display piece in the Louvre. Ukraine has been supplied with weapons, ammunition, medical supplies, vehicles, and more from just about every country that has the capability to do so, making for a very well-armed military force. With the Ukrainians fighting the Russians on the battlefield, the rest of the world has been fighting them on the economic front. Since it began, Russia has been hit with devastating economic sanctions, preventing them from importing and exporting goods from numerous countries. Many Russian banks are now no longer allowed to use the SWIFT system, making international money transfers extremely difficult. Assets of many Russian billionaires from overseas banks have been frozen, and we all know how much billionaires love their assets. Russian media has been blocked everywhere outside of Russia, meaning Russian propaganda has little ability to spread outside of Russia, including to the many Russian soldiers currently in Ukraine. Private companies are pulling out or have already done so across Russia, including tech companies, social media platforms, energy companies, Visa, MasterCard. Disney isn't going to be showing their films in Russian theaters, and the most impactful consequence of all, Pornhub is now no longer providing service to Russia. This is only a handful of moves made by Western governments and businesses, and many more sanctions and business shutdowns have already been announced. Many people are now asking, is Putin an idiot? Did he not expect this would happen? I don't happen to think Putin is stupid at all, and I think he planned on facing a number of sanctions while preparing this invasion. But I don't think he expected to unite the entire world, including governments, businesses, and regular people against him. Which leads us to the final question, how will this end? I don't think this is going to end well for Putin. The invasion is wildly unpopular in Russia and abroad, and will only become more so as videos of Ukrainian children's hospitals being bombed continue to emerge. Many of the soldiers sent to Ukraine are scared teenagers who were drafted and sent in with no information as to where they were going, then shoved out the back of an APC with a Kalashnikov to fire at civilians, who they were told would welcome them as liberators. They also weren't supplied with enough food or fuel, leading many hungry Russian soldiers to abandon their tanks and wander around on foot until they're captured by Ukrainian soldiers. The many who have been captured are then learning that they've been lied to, and are relaying that information back to family and friends in Russia, many of whom are still being fed a 6-course meal of propaganda. Things also aren't going great for the Russians back home. Many of the sanctions and penalties levied towards Russia are aimed at Putin and his inner circle. But sanctions like these inevitably fall back on the general population, which are hitting the Russian people hard. Their money is worth nothing. The many companies shutting down means mass job losses. Protesters are being arrested or killed. Stores are running out of supplies, and this is only the first week. Things are going to get a lot worse in both Ukraine and Russia, and I have no idea what that's going to look like in the coming days, weeks, and months. The Russian population has been increasingly dissatisfied with Putin's actions in recent years, and the effectiveness of the Russian state media's relentless propaganda is diminishing. The Russian people are angry, the Russian military is quickly finding out just how little Putin values their lives, and Russian billionaires aren't just going to sit around while their money becomes worthless. Putin no doubt currently has tons of people who are loyal to him, but when you rule with fear, it doesn't take much for that to change. I don't know what Putin's end goal is here, but he sure is acting like the Russian Revolution wasn't a thing that happened. I don't know how much longer he has, but I think this is the beginning of the end of Putin's 20+ year reign of terror. But another revolution in Russia would be a very messy and complicated ordeal that I am out of time to speculate on. So for now, Slava Ukraine!